Welcome back to another episode of Building Bridges, Strengthening the Educator-Caregiver Relationship. This is the podcast where we discuss the best ways for K-12 educators and caregivers to support children in all aspects of their social, academic, and emotional development. Today's episode looks ahead, not to spring break, not even to summer break, but to the next school year already, to the 2024-25 school year, because today we're talking about kindergarten readiness. We've heard a lot lately about kids' struggles with literacy, math, and other measurements, both academic and non-academic, coming out of the pandemic. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, known as the OECD, found what they called, quote, an unprecedented drop in performance, end quote, across 81 countries, with reading scores falling by 10 points and math by 15. Yet these data points, troubling as they are, involve older students. And we have to ask, how are our young children doing now that we're past the pandemic? Our quote-unquote pandemic babies, who may not have attended preschool or early childhood programs during lockdowns and closures. According to the U.S. Census Department, enrollment for 3 to 6-year-olds in the U.S. dropped by 9.3% between 2019 and 2021. Numbers are rebounding now, however, but there are still significant variations across communities and across different states. To discuss this today, I'm joined by Selina Oliver, a Nationally Certified School Psychologist and assessment consultant with Pearson Clinical Assessments. Pearson is the world's largest educational company. Selina's going to chat with us about things educators and caregivers can do to bridge these readiness gaps as kiddos enter kindergarten. Selina, thank you so much for joining me today.
Rose, thank you so much for having me. This is such a wonderful topic. In many ways, kindergarten readiness sets a foundation upon which the future success, academic success, vocational success will lie. This is also a time period that provides parents, caregivers, and educators with an opportunity to strengthen that foundation.
I 100% agree. Both when I was a student, I still remember my kindergarten teacher's name, Mrs. Grelly. I loved being in kindergarten. It was fun as a child. And when my own kids went, I loved their kindergarten teachers and I loved their experiences. It's such a fun time in early childhood. And so families are looking at signing up kids right now. Like we're in, late winter, early spring. They're signing up their kids now for starting kindergarten this fall. Can you tell us kind of what does the landscape look like for those who are just in kindergarten this year? Like what are educators seeing in their classrooms?
So I think in general, pretty good news. It's better than last year. Kids who are entering kindergarten in 2024, as we know, you've already alluded to, those are the students who were born just prior to the pandemic. So as a result, that ever-critical developmental period between birth and 3 years old would have been spent in some isolation. They would have had limited social, cognitive, motor, self-regulation, and other engagement opportunities. So as a result, though, kindergarten really provides a great opportunities for these babies to catch up in these developmental areas. Nevertheless, there are some challenges ahead. Over 80% of public schools are still struggling to hire educators to support these strong kindergarten classrooms. That staffing shortage is particularly evident in low-income communities.
And it's disappointing and difficult to hear about how these staffing shortages continue, given that reality, that resources are constrained for those in the classroom. What are some milestones that educators should be keeping an eye out for determining kindergarten readiness?
Yeah, so I would say, as an educator, it's tough to work in those high student-teacher ratios. The good news is that educators are feeling more optimistic about being in the classroom than they have in the past few years, and some of that excitement of teaching is returning. Nevertheless, though, there are some readiness milestones that teachers and parents should be paying attention to. Kindergarten readiness involves many different skills. However, when most folks think about kindergarten readiness, they tend to think about those 3 R's, right? Academic readiness. So reading, writing, letters, numbers, really things with an academic focus. But at this point, academic readiness would be the least of my concerns as far as preparedness goes, because we can teach those academic skills. The skills that are perhaps more important for kindergarten readiness include things like physical readiness. So developing that fine motor control for school-related tasks like cutting, pasting, drawing, and writing, or gross motor skills for playing on the playground, getting on and off the school bus, carrying the backpack, developing overall physical endurance for working for 8 hours, because for many of our kids, this long time frame is going to be the first time they're introduced to really having to attend for 8 hours. Self-care is also an important readiness area. Examples of self-care can include the ability to put shoes and coats on and off, the ability to go to the restroom independently, to wash hands, the ability to open a juice box or sandwich bag at lunchtime. So having these skills in place will make the school day more productive, less scary, and more efficient for students.
That's so interesting to think about those everyday tasks like opening a juice box or taking your coat on and off, those things that we maybe don't think about, but in a school environment when everyone's moving and everyone's got somewhere to be, something to do, that those are critical. So that kind of brings up a good question. Your point about academic skills, hey, those, we can teach those down the line if need be. What about social skills?
I would say that social and problem solving is one of the most important skills. So I mentioned that we can teach those academic skills, but teaching and developing social problem solving skills, it's a little more challenging. Parents can help by teaching their child 3 basic problem solving goals. The first is teaching kids how to get immediate help for high-risk problems. For this, they need who to go to for a high-risk problem and what a high-risk problem is. Next, it's important to teach a child how to ask for help. Not all kids know this, and once you enter a school environment, it's really important to be able to ask a teacher, can you repeat this, or I didn't get that, or I don't understand, or I'm having a problem with this, can you help me? Finally, kids who are taught a specific problem-solving strategy, like Ask 3 Before Me for some low-risk problems, they're more likely to develop effective interpersonal success.
Can you provide an example for our listeners of a high-risk problem?
Sure. So a high-risk problem is I'm getting ready to throw up or, the Bobby has a pair of scissors and he just cut himself accidentally with it. So those things that really need, immediate attention, or there's going to be some dire outcomes. A low-risk problem might be like my pencil eraser fell off my pencil. So it's important to the student because they want their eraser, but they need to know okay, that's something that I'm going to approach differently in terms of asking for help than asking for help if somebody next to me is bleeding.
That makes sense.
So moving on with some other things that might be helpful for kindergarten readiness. We know it's never a disadvantage to teach those basic academics like counting, letters, and phonics. But self-regulation is another area of maturation which will really help with school readiness. This might include things like waiting in line, taking turns, following directions, listening while the teacher reads the story. But it can also include things such as being able to ignore distractions while working, being able to wait patiently for the teacher to provide help. It can also mean being able to manage hurt feelings when we get picked last for the team. So, if we get an answer wrong, that can really feel devastating. If we can't figure out the answer, if another kid is using the marker we wanted to use, those are all things that can really derail the emotions of a kindergarten student. So helping kids learn how to manage those hurt feelings will help them be more successful in school.
That gets back to something we had talked about in an earlier episode of Building Bridges about social emotional learning. And that recognizing your emotions and being able to kind of keep them under control. So we're talking about a lot of different, from academic to SEL skills for kids. What else can caregivers do to make sure that their kiddos are ready?
So Rose, you bring up an important point. Kindergarten readiness isn't just for the student. So the readiness of that household is also extremely important. A kid going off to school is going to drive a lot of routines and activity in the household. So household readiness includes having a healthy sleep regimen to ensure the child's alertness throughout the school day. In other words, no more of that late night TV watching or late night playing with apps and on iPads and things like that. Adequate nutrition is going to be essential. In terms of routines, setting aside some time for your child to talk about their school day with you is not only going to help you stay aware of what your child needs, but it's going to help your child see that you feel education has a high place of value. And I can tell you, nurturing this activity while your babies are young It's going to provide you great relief throughout the school years, especially one, if an unpleasant situation ever arises, you already have kind of those lines of communications open. But when your child gets to middle school and those stakes are higher, you'll be really happy that you have this routine in place.
I 100% agree. It's I lived it, seen it. It's true. So let's talk about assessments for a minute. So given the situation with preschool enrollment, being lower largely than it was pre-pandemic, do you think it makes sense to conduct assessments when kids get to kindergarten and then move forward based on the findings of those assessments?
So I think assessment at any age is valuable. Any educator will tell you that really effective education comes down to a series of different assessment types. Ultimately, it comes down to the decision of benefits versus costs. So one option for this age range is universal screening. Universal screening takes a look at all students. It's considered to be a highly equitable approach. It provides school districts with great opportunities for what I call upsizing student achievement. It's very cost effective, but most importantly, it can be done with limited disruption to classroom instruction. Now, for these kids coming into school, they need a lot of classroom instruction. You don't want them out of the classroom instruction for excessive assessment, but assessment is really necessary to making sure they're getting the correct education. So universal screening kind of takes care of all of that. In addition to it being time and cost effective, it allows school districts to have the information they need to make important decisions about the allocation of their staff, the allocation of other resources, so that they can provide those targeted interventions that's going to allow the upsizing of students at each individual level of need. So, for example, universal screening can help districts identify kids who are on the gifted end of the scale who would benefit from gifted instruction, while also identifying children at the other end of the spectrum who are at risk of failure and also need crucial targeted intervention. So, Rose, the answer to your question is an emphatic yes.
Yeah, no, that it sounds like it, and that makes a lot of sense. So what should educators do first when they identify students who maybe aren't ready based on state guidelines, assessment data, or just what they're observing day to day? What would you suggest, Selina, would be kind of their first step?
The first thing I would do is open a dialogue with parents about their child's functioning. So parents are the expert on their child. Educators are the experts in education. And as such, they're in a great position to develop a partnership that's really going to grow the next set of America's future. Having conversations about perceived weaknesses can be uncomfortable for everyone involved. We know that. Many parents at this crucial stage in their child's life, they're very excited about their kid entering kindergarten. And as such, some of those parents can become defensive about any perception that they haven't prepared their child for school. The good news is that most educators have experience with these tough conversations. A good entry into this conversation can be as simple as, tell me what you're seeing at home, or what does Maltese enjoy doing and is really excited about and excels well in? Do you have any area of concerns? And then as educator, you can follow up with, well, this is what we're seeing at school. Be sure you provide some positive examples, but also be honest about your concerns in areas where the child is struggling. Educators can also consult with their professional staff colleagues about specific assessments or interventions that might be helpful to the student. Assessment information is critical to selecting and implementing effective evidence-based interventions. So something as simple as a basic concept assessment, which does not require a lot of time, can identify areas of immediate need that can be easily resolved with great student outcomes.
And that brings up a great point, Selina, about kind of a data-based approach. How would you recommend that educators begin to speak to caregivers about these topics and what they're seeing? Because like you said, it can be sensitive.
It is. So to add on to what I mentioned earlier, educators should be culturally aware, but they should also bring some objective data and examples to the table. It can also be helpful to share that all children learn and develop at different rates. And this is especially common in this younger age band. And that can help relieve some parental stress and some parental resistance, so to speak. And it keeps parents with the sense of optimism. However, I will say that if an educator suspects serious deficits, then early intervention is key, and one wouldn't want to delay support to avoid hurt feelings. So it's a delicate balance for sure, which sometimes requires a team approach. Also, if you're having a conversation with a parent, it would be helpful to have some simple and practical solutions you can bring to the table. But also, remember, parents are experts on their children, and so educators should be open to propose solutions from the caregivers.
I love what you said earlier about parents being the experts in their child and educators being experts in education. I think that this point really drives that home, and where there's a great opportunity for that back and forth and that team approach with caregivers. So when would you recommend that educators should be making this kind of outreach and this kind of communication? Is this for parent-teacher conferences, communications being sent home, all the above? Well, what do you recommend?
So that's a tough question because some parents just have a need for more information, especially if the child is struggling. Other parents don't want to be bombarded and overwhelmed with information. So it's a delicate balance. Certainly conferences are a given, that's an opportune time to have some feedback. If a child is struggling, I don't think I would wait for a conference. I would maybe want to have some earlier communications, but it could be as simple as just making sure that you're sending home the students' work samples or the students' report cards so the parent can see as they're going along how their child is performing. It's really difficult to not have any information that you've shared with a parent and then have a parent come into a conference and for the parent to feel like they're ambushed and hearing for the first time that a child is struggling. So I think just kind of ongoing communication. Parents will let you know how much feedback they want. They'll either start, ignoring your emails and your work samples, or they'll be calling you and say, can you give me more report? But I think the thing is you just kind of have to develop that relationship with each parent individually.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And that actually leads me to my next question, which is, well, let's look at it from the caregiver's point of view. Are there things that families can do at home to reinforce what kids are learning in kindergarten? And I'm not only referring to academics here, but just some of those social skills and SEL skills that we talked about. What are some things you recommend that can be done in the home?
Sure. Great question. So I've already mentioned having that kind of daily routine where you're having a dialogue with your student about what's happening in school. And it does have to be, definitely should not be an inquisition, right? You're opening a conversation. Tell me what happened at recess.
How was your day?
How was your lunch today? Exactly. But I'm going to say the biggest thing is really having two-way interactions with your child. There's a lot of research about how parents prepare kids for school. And, that one-way conversation where you're teaching letters and numbers and the child is just kind of regurgitating information is not as successful as just really getting in and letting your child develop some expression and letting your child participate. So while it's important to, point out and name objects, it's equally important to encourage your child to use their vocabulary. A great way to do this that is fun for everybody and is not stressful is playing with your child, especially role play. So that's a great way to introduce social problem solving concepts. So, let your pretend characters in your play make mistakes and recover from them. So have your child pretend to be characters, you pretend to be characters, talk out loud using problem-solving dialogue. For example, oh my, I wanted to play with the red ball and Sally took it. That's okay. Red is just a color. I can play with the blue ball now and have just as much fun. So being able to vocalize what a character might say to themselves in kind of a tough situation can really help your child internalize some of that problem-solving dialogue. You can play school about taking turns, listening to the teacher, using school supplies. So really, play has unlimited potential. Also, taking opportunities during play to identify and label feelings is always helpful. For example, I'm sad that I didn't get to play with the red ball, or I'm looking forward to going to the movie. And you might add on, that feeling is called excited. So just giving your kids some vocabulary to express what they're feeling.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's fun. It's not, something that's just instruction. It's allowing them to express their own creativity too. And it's more fun for the parents.
Sure. Some other things that might be helpful would be having some routines in your household that might mimic the routines that are needed in a school setting. So, at home, having your clean up toys, having them make their bed, teaching important social concepts like responsibility, delayed gratification, and patience. Or when you go to a restaurant, that's a great way to practice skills that a kid might need in the cafeteria. Like when we go to a restaurant, we have to, especially if it's fast food, we have to wait in line to place our order, just like what a child might experience in the cafeteria line. Finally, we all make mistakes, and it's important to let children make safe mistakes. So letting children problem solve before we step in to solve their problem for them. We always want to be supportive, and we always want to teach them how to solve a problem, but really kind of letting them make their mistakes, letting them work through the process of solving the problem on their own is going to breed self-confidence and independence. And so they're going to recognize that mistakes happen. They're not disasters, but that they have a problem-solving strategy to overcome that mistake, and they're not relying on someone else to fix the mistake for them. We're talking about 5-year-olds, so, this is still an early stage of you doing that, but it definitely is something that you can even introduce at 2, 3, and 4 years old, of letting kids try to really figure out how to solve things on their own, but being there when they can't, but give them the chance to fail successfully.
I think that is a fantastic point, Selina. And I know, just speaking as a parent, there's always that urge to step in and fix it when you see something going wrong. But yeah, even these little kiddos do have the ability and have to learn and continue cultivating the ability to overcome, nothing that is, really, really serious, but minor bumps in the road, so to speak. That's how they learn to overcome the big bumps later on down the road. And it's a wonderful skill to start instilling at this time.
Yeah. And it's even as simple as you're asking a child to, build a tower of blocks and they don't get it right the first time. You just keep letting them keep figuring it out. So introduce that early, that they can just keep trying. And then when they get to the tough stuff later on, they've already kind of developed some strategies.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we've talked a lot about what educators can do. Now we've talked about what caregivers can do in the home. To be honest, and you know this as well as anyone, everyone's very busy and educators have so much on their plates. And in some earlier episodes of this podcast, we've even talked about, the additive nature of a lot of this work and how those educators are having things added to their plates they need to work on, but nothing is getting taken away to free up the time and the resources to be able to do so. So when we're talking about kindergarten readiness, is there anything that outside kind of structural supports, governmental support, whatever that may be, are there things that like society at a larger scale could be doing to help, especially since we've seen readiness vary so much within states?
Well, Rose, you may already be aware that the Biden administration is proposing $500 million for preschool programs. So approving that would make a huge difference. There's also another federal effort called the Kindergarten Sturdy Bridge Learning Community. This is designed to help kids transition from kindergarten to first grade. And that community is a multi-state effort to make kindergarten a transformational experience at the start of each student's formal educational journey. State education associations, local education associations are going to be invited to participate in a community of practice where they can benefit from peer learning. They can receive technical assistance. They can share their best practices to transform how students experience kindergarten. And they'll talk about things such as transitions into kindergarten and first grade. Back in December 2021, that department launched 2 new multi-state communities of practice to support states in addressing the impact of lost instructional time from the pandemic, with a specific focus on student mental health and academic well-being. The department has also been working with states and stakeholders to identify ways to leverage federal funding to support high-quality early learning and also the early learning workforce. Remember, I mentioned earlier that states are still kind of suffering from not having a strong workforce. There's just a lot of federal dollars, really, that are available to help meet some of the needs that will allow activities to encourage students to have healthy growth and development.
That makes sense. And I think there's even still ESSER funds that are out there. So it's not necessarily that there are no resources, is that they need to be directed to programs and to situations that are going to have the most impact. So let's talk about transitional kindergarten. So this is interesting. It's a 2-year approach to kindergarten instead of the traditional 1 year. Selina, what do you think about transitional kindergarten? Do you think that this is a better approach?
Well, overall, there are 3 approaches to kindergarten readiness. The first is redshirting. So redshirting is essentially waiting an additional year before the child enters kindergarten.
It's like a redshirt freshman, like with in college football.
Exactly.
For a redshirt freshman kindergartner.
Right. So most school districts in the country have mandatory kindergarten enrollment mandates and that don't allow this option of redshirting, except under very certain individualized conditions. The second approach is repeating kindergarten. So in this approach, students are going to participate in kindergarten 1 year, and then next year they would essentially repeat the same curriculum. Now, historically, research has said that repeating kindergarten results in poor outcomes later down the road. So it's going to be interesting to see if any universities are going to conduct some longitudinal studies of our COVID kindergarten repeaters to see if that same negative outcome occurs. It may not with our COVID kids, but historically, just repeating kindergarten has not had the desired outcome that we want. Now, another option that's becoming popular is transitional kindergarten, which I think is what you specifically asked about. So transitional kindergarten is a 2-year kindergarten program. The student is not repeating the kindergarten curriculum, right? They're receiving a 2-year kindergarten experience that's designed to focus on catching up and building essential kindergarten readiness skills. So this transitional kindergarten experience might be appropriate for kids with late birth dates who might also have some soft developmental or social emotional delays. The thought is that this extra time in which they're also receiving instruction will result in more of that biological brain maturation and offer a window of time for structured remediation of delayed skills. Each approach has their pros and cons, and ultimately it should be an individualized choice based on the needs of the student.
And that brings up a great point. If not maybe taking those 2 years in a transitional kindergarten, but you mentioned, just the biological brain development and kind of this longer period of time. What about waiting to send kids to kindergarten until they're 6 years old instead of 5 years?
Yeah, interesting and a great question. There are some European cultures that don't even start formal education until their kids are 7. But I think it ultimately comes down to what's happening during that time off. So is the child home watching TV, playing video games, which will probably just perpetuate and grow delays? Or is the child engaged in meaningful play and developmental activities, which are going to stimulate their growth, their health, and their social problem solving? Is the child having enriched encounters with an extended peer group, which is going to broaden their social and cultural development? Is there an active effort during that year to teach important skills like self-care, social interaction, self-regulation, and those prerequisite learning behaviors like listening to a story, waiting in line, or asking for help? However, I can't say this strongly enough, for kids who are at risk, the data are compelling that early intervention is key for closing the gap. So for those kids, just, a simple year of physical maturation is probably not going to be enough to close the gap. And time is really going to be critical for those kids as that intervention clock is going to start ticking.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a very important point. And reminds me that there is so much to talk about, like with this topic. We could talk about this for so long, and we're coming up on time here. So before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, Selina, what are your top 3 suggestions for ensuring that kids are ready for kindergarten?
Prioritize self-regulation and social skills above academic readiness. Teach basic academic and language concepts, which include that school-based vocabulary. So things like desk, classroom, recess, cafeteria, chalk, blackboard, hallway, textbook. Things that are, so it's going to be new language concepts that a child maybe did not learn at home. And also providing your household with healthy routines for eating, sleeping, studying, and playing.
All of that is so important. Such good advice. So that is all the time that we have today. But Selina, thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And thank you as well to our listeners. And we hope that you learned some strategies today that will help you connect with caregivers and set your kindergarten kiddos up for success. If you'd like to learn more about supporting children during early childhood, you can visit Pearson's Early Childhood Resource Center at, all one word, pearsonassessments.com. and find more resources for building kindergarten readiness. Thank you again so much for listening to Building Bridges. And if you'd like to learn more, you can check back on that same website, pearsonassessments.com, to see what's coming.